So let's talk about the new and dangerous War Dog Karnivore and just how bloodthirsty we can make one of these things. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Knights once more and put together some of the combos that the new book offers us. A week or so ago we took a look at the new Psychic Knights, the Abominant, though today I thought we'd take a look on the brutal new melee War Dog and put it through its paces to see what it can achieve. First up, we'll take a quick look at its datasheet, talk through all the many layers of buffs and synergies that you can potentially put on Chaos Knights like this, a couple of potential build ideas, including how to make it very fighty indeed, and a few thoughts on in-game use. So the War Dog Karnivore is an 140 points for an Armiger class knight. It's a Lord of War choice like the rest of the Imperial and Chaos Knights, and you get 1 to 3 models in a squad, so they are fairly easy to spam if so desired. Most of the stat line is fairly similar to the standard War Dogs. It's got a strength of 6 and toughness of 7, 12 wounds and a 3+ save, but basically to reward it for having 2 different combat weapons rather than having a powerful gun. Its weapon skill goes up to a 2+ and it gets 5 attacks, and it's also decently faster with getting to melee with a big 14-inch movement. Weapons wise, its main 2 combat armaments are a Reaper Chain Talon and a Slaughter Claw. The Chain Talon is largely the one that you want to be using against hordes. It's got 2 modes, either a Strength +4, AP -4 and Damage 3 attack, or a Sweep attack at AP -3, Strength 6, and you get double the attacks, so usually 10. The other option is the more anti-tank busting Slaughter Claw, going up to Strength 12 as its Strength ×2, AP -3 and a big damage D3+3. Usually you'd want to use that against most heavy targets. The only exception will be if the AP -4 makes a difference and your target has got 3 or less wounds. In combat it is a fairly fearsome little beast, as you'd probably expect, as that's mainly what it's doing. Against toughness 7 or 8 vehicles without any invul save, it averages around about 11 wounds. Roughly 3 dead, 2 or 3 wound Space Marines with armor of contempt, and usually 5 or 6 dead models when it's fighting a horde, depending on exactly what saves they have or how tough they are. Pretty good that it's fairly general purpose, as often with combat you're not going to have the biggest choice as to what you're fighting, you'll often have to make do with whatever you can catch. Perhaps raw value wise though, I think it's usually going to be a little bit better into heavy targets and elites, as opposed to chewing through hordes. Otherwise it's got a few other special rules and bits of kit. It's got the normal Knight Ion shields, the Harbingers of Dread rule to make all your leadership go worse, and the War Dog Squadron special rule, which means that you can set up near each other and then act independently. It does get the choice of a small ranged attack, either a Diabolus Heavy Stubber at 4 shots at strength 5 and a 36-inch range, or you can pay an extra 5 points to upgrade to a Havoc multi-launcher, extra range, D6 shots at the same profile, and it can also target units that aren't visible to it, which is kind of handy. I think the Havoc launcher isn't particularly bad, but usually I'd be more tempted to keep it cheap with the Stubber. With a dedicated melee beast, I think at least sometimes you're just going to want to advance to get the extra movement towards your foe, so there's a reasonable chance that the ranged guns aren't going to be firing anyway. Finally, keywords wise, it has most of the normal ones that you'd expect. Perhaps the only slightly surprising and interesting ones is the Terror Shades keyword. Apparently this thing's also quite good at having Demon Bird's Nest in it, and that can allow access to a couple of things, including a stratagem and relic. Overall, it's a fairly simple and savage beast, fairly fast, at least reasonably tough per points compared with the other War Dogs, and it packs an absolutely massive punch in melee, dealing reasonable damage to just about anything that it hits. So aside from raw stats, let's talk about some of the ways that we can get more out of a War Dog then. First up, it's got Harbingers of Dread, which might help out its survivability a little bit in the later turns. But even in the earlier ones, I think it might be a particularly good choice for delivering that aura, say if you did want any debuffs on the enemy army, either just the leadership thing, or maybe even removing OBSEC as well. It moves fast and is pretty cheap for that big 12-inch aura, so it seems like it's often going to be a decent delivery system for that on the outskirts of your army. Next up, it can either be Infernal or Iconoclast. Iconoclast really helps its combat potential, an extra attack and extra AP on the charge. Depending on whether that AP matters or not, it's usually going to be around an extra 20 to 30% more damage. Infernal, on the other hand, I think interests me the most for the +3-inch move that you might be able to get. You do have to take mortal wounds to get there, but that would give you a base 17-inch move essentially, allowing you to pull off just some crazy long charges. I suppose +1 to wound on one of the combat weapons isn't terrible either. You do have to take some fairly hefty damage to get that off though. Transhuman physiology also doesn't hurt at all. I guess might still be an okay trade-off if you know it's going to get focused by heavy guns next turn. Stratagems wise, War Dogs have access to an absolute ton of stuff, though I'd argue that quite a few of these are fairly low yield. There's a whole bunch of really common staples that Chaos Knights are going to be wanting to use all the time. 1 CP to auto-explode is great on an expendable melee unit. Potentially charging in, killing a bunch of stuff, then almost planning to get killed in return could even be a pretty reasonable strategy if you can guarantee that you're going to coat a whole load of units in a mortal wound explosion. 1 CP for the Chaos version of Rotate Ion Shields is great. It's 1 command point to reroll hit rolls of 1 versus a unit on an objective. Could be a small amount extra damage if you need yet more. I think the 1 command point for -1 damage in melee is absolutely excellent on this guy. If you happen to be charging something that's got 2 damage and you think that there's a reasonable chance of them killing you or doing major damage, then you could make them very unhappy with that. It's 2 CP to fall back and charge, a bit on the pricey side unless you can do something really quite gamey and powerful. And there's options for War Dogs getting 6s to hit auto wound, and 2 War Dogs getting +1 attack against 1 target, though I think both of those are almost so niche damage output boost that they're rarely going to be used. Death Grip could give you the chance to ignore invul saves against a key enemy character. If you beat them on a roll off for 1 CP, that could be worth it. And Infernal Knight can give you the chance to regenerate wounds per slain model. If you're going into a horde with a really big attacks version of this guy, then that could be worth it too. There's another nice boost if you use the 1 command point for +1 attack when using the sweep profile. That does seem like it could be a reasonable amount of extra damage against hordes. And there's the stratagem for Ravenous Terror Shades. That's the one that gives you a chance to bump off some enemies in the morale phase. Could be a nice little trick to have up its sleeve if you just fail to kill your target, and then the enemy unit that's going to survive will score them points or something. Overall, it's a crazy ton of options. I don't think you'd want to dump all your CP into one of your fairly cheap knights, but for me, really quite a lot of these do seem pretty decent value. Maybe my favourites are the Auto Explode, Rotate Ion Shield, the -1 damage in melee, and Death Grip and the +1 attack on the sweep profile both seem like they could be okay if you're fighting the right targets. Like the big knights, you can have a favour of the Dark Gods on these as well. They're quite cheap on War Dogs, and I'd be quite tempted to pick one of these up, as in my opinion they do tend to give some pretty decent buffs and debuffs. The Corn Collar of Infernal Brass can give you a -2 to cast, the Throne of Skulls can allow you to reroll charges, and when you make your favoured ability 6s to hit auto explode. The Slanesh Quicksilver Throne can give you heroic intervention and always fights first. Not too bad if you just want to park this guy on a midfield objective and have him fight all comers. The Slanesh Beguiling Majesty gives him -1 to hit and wound in melee, making him a real problem to remove if that's your best opponent's way of removing him. The Subjugated Machine Spirit can allow you to advance and charge when it's in favoured mode, though I think that would be a bit of a gamble trying to get there. The Mark of the Dread Knight for 20 points gives him a 6+ Feel No Pain and a 5+ if favoured. Maybe kind of additionally useful, as that one could allow you access to the Chaos Undivided Gets Back Up on a 4+ stratagem. Being extra tough to put down and then have a reasonable chance of standing up to kill something anew seems good to me. And Blessing of the Dark Master is 20 points to prevent your opponents re-rolling hit or wound rolls against him. I think for these, most of them are pretty reflective of what you get for the points. I think out of these, maybe my favourites are Beguiling Majesty for the melee protection, as he's almost certainly going to be getting there, and perhaps the Dread Knight one, particularly if you make the 5+ favoured ability and getting back up on death. The Chaos Knights certainly don't have anywhere near as much synergy as the Imperial Knight big knights do, but I suppose if you've got one of those tanky abominants striding up towards the enemy, then getting a 6+ Feel No Pain from that will be quite good. It does require the spell to be cast on an 8 or more though, which isn't exactly reliable. Theoretically, you could pick up a 4+ invul save from the Knight Tyrant stratagem, though that does feel a bit big investment to me. I think that might be a bit better if you've got a bunch of ranged war dogs rather than the melee one. And Knight Rampagers, if you've got one of them charging up alongside you, that could give you reroll ones to hit in melee. I feel like those kind of aura buffs are a bit clunky though, and just might not necessarily be worth it compared with both knights positioning themselves optimally and going after their own targets or staying safe as necessary. Most of the time I think you'll want the warlord traits on the big knights, though a couple of them could be useful. There's one for +1 to advance and charge and getting an extra attack if you're within your opponent's deployment zone. That one does combine quite nicely with the Warpborn Stalker Deep Strike option from Favour of the Gods, if you did just want to drop this guy in from Deep Strike Reserve and then attempt to make an 8-inch charge into combat. The other maybe interesting one is Warp Haunted Hull, as he might get into deny range a bit more, though again I suspect that's probably going to be better on the big knights, as they're likely to stick around for more of the game. Kind of similarly for relics, quite a lot of them really want to be used on the big knights rather than the war dogs. Iconoclast ones could use the Veil for the 4+ invul, though it's got a lot more value if it saves you the 2 CP to rotate ion shields on a big knight. The Blasphemous Engine could allow you to Iconoclast overheat a bit easier, and the Panoply of the Cursed Knights could give you that 2+ save. I'd say the most interesting one really though is the Helm of Dogs, which just gives you a flat melee boost with +1 attack, and also an aura of reroll 1s to wound, which still seems to apply to the bearer itself. Between the two of them, that's another very good melee boost there. It's usually going to be around about an extra 40% damage compared with what you'd have just at base. Which Dread household you go with is generally going to be an army decision rather than just based around any one knight, but maybe some of the most obviously good ones could be Herpatrax or Lucaris out of the Iconoclast ones. Extra wounds on the chassis from Herpatrax is great, and you could use 1 command point for Warping Presence, which could be alright on an aggressive War Dog. That one gives you a little bit of a chance to deal some splash damage mortal wounds if you're in a position where it's going to be useful. Lucaris has a small melee buff when fighting, allowing you to reroll 1 hit or wound roll, perhaps a lot more helpful if you're going to be using it on the damage D3+3 attacks compared with sweeps. For the Infernals though, House Vextrix has a relic that allows you to get a +2-inch move, which you could combine with the Infernal Overcharge for a 20-inch move, and you also get +1 damage on its attacks as well, which is a nice little bonus. Seems quite good both for delivery and hitting extra hard when you get there. Commentis does look like a really interesting one. That's the one where you get to pick 2 different results on the Infernal table. So you could combine the movement buff with the +1 to wound in melee, or make the knight tougher with transhuman physiology, and that's a far better trade-off for the mortal wounds that you take. They've also got a 1 command point stratagem to allow a War Dog to arrive from strategic reserve early as well. Could be another way to get an early charge on your opponent, though it is going to be far from guarantees. Otherwise, for Fell Bonds, you can get exploding 6s to hit in melee from an Iconoclast one, which could be a nice little buff to add to the stack. Finally, for playing the mission, I'd say it's going to be quite a good one for stealing objectives from the opponent. It's the cheapest and fastest War Dog just to throw onto middle objectives for Primaris, so it's quite a nice one just for pinging forwards to steal the objectives from under the enemy's noses if you're trying to get Stranglehold or Ruthless Tyranny. If you're going for the actions one as well, it seems like it could be a good choice for cursing midfield objectives. As knights go, having the cheapest points cost means it's one of the most expendable. I thought it might be fun just to see exactly how much damage you could do if you put on a few reasonable buffs, so here's just one idea for a fairly dangerous War Dog. If we had this guy be an Iconoclast Knight for the extra 1 attack and AP -1, and you go all in on a melee household that's using that Dres Bond for the exploding 6s, and then on top of that you give it the Helm of Dogs for a +1 attack and reroll 1s, maybe combining the whole thing with one of those demonic favours for a defensive boost. Damage wise, between the Iconoclast and the Helm you get up to 7 attacks, all hitting on 2s with exploding 6s and rerolling 1s to wounds. It's fairly crazy stuff when it already had quite a good choice of damage profiles to start with. If you're fighting hordes, I'd almost certainly use the extra 1 command point for an extra attack per sweep mode attack. That puts you up into a pretty crazy 21 attacks hitting on 2s. I would average something like 16 dead toughness 3 hordes, a few less if you're going to be going against toughness 4. Against Space Marines, the extra AP is really good against chewing through Armour of Contempt, so you're usually going to be averaging about 7 of them dead. Invuls could certainly bite into that, but if all you had to do was chew through the invul save of 1 powerful character, you could think about trying Death Grip perhaps. Finally, vehicles with that Warp Strike Claw, it just absolutely obliterates if you don't have invuls. 27 wounds on average to a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle. Theoretically, if this one angry boy manages to make it into a standard Imperial or Chaos Knight, then it's got a pretty decent chance of just ripping it to shreds then and there. It's really very decent damage indeed for a fast 140 point model, particularly without having to use a wombo combo of stratagems. It's just 1 CP against hordes if it makes the difference. I think often though, maybe the main challenge could be actually just delivering them into combat, though as we've talked about in the buffs and synergies, there are a fair few ways of doing that. Combine the Warpborn Stalker, Demonic Favour, and the +1 to charge Warlord trait, and you've got a 66% charge at a Deep Strike Knight, presuming you do budget a command point reroll for if you fail. It seems okay, but I do wonder if that might be better served on one of the big, more threatening knights. Keeping one of them off the board and safe to strike anew could be a really scary threat to have just hanging there. Otherwise, Vextrix with that Heretic Power Core could be nice. +2-inch move from that and an extra +3 inches from Infernal gives you a nice 19-inch move. And Commentis has that ability to turn up from a strategic reserve early, again could be stacked with the +1 to charge trait, though I feel that might be a bit better with a mixed shooting and melee War Dog, as again you're not really guaranteed to make that charge. In general though, I feel like as these guys are the cheapest knights in the army, it might not actually matter all that much. They can be used for screening purposes and just charge anything that they can get their teeth into, if the enemy does leave something within strike range. So overall, in game, I feel like these War Dog Karnivores are pretty decently stronger in melee than the other War Dogs. Just on their base profile, they're usually going to have an extra 50% damage against most targets. Never mind the big bonus on top of that from the choice of multiple profiles to tailor to your situation. The boosted movement and a bit more freedom to advance without giving up shooting helps as well, though of course you are trading out something like a Demon Breath Spear, which does have a fair amount of damage at range. My instincts are that it's probably not going to be the way to field an entire army of these, maybe something like 1 to 4 of them for expendable midfield bruisers, to bully enemy units on midfield objectives, and to be the first wave of knights that your opponent has to crash into, fight through this, and then hopefully your biggest off can counter-attack and destroy them after. I feel like as dedicated melee platforms, it might be a bit possible to overinvest in these, and you probably don't want too many carnivores, just in case you're playing an army that's really good at screening, or you've got too much terrain to easily be able to hit the enemy, or you've got targets that you just don't really want to charge for fear of just being killed back in return. I'd say screening and terrain are probably their biggest weaknesses, along with the durability being a little bit underwhelming with no invul saves in melee. Overall though, I would rate the War Dog Karnivore as a pretty strong one, decent enough on its own stats, and can certainly be a fair bit better in the right Dread household, or with certain ones of those demonic favours, and maybe that relic helm of dogs if you're feeling generous. Let me know your thoughts though, I'll be interested to hear your ideas on this guy. Is he looking like a usable part of the Chaos Knight army? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming, with new videos out just about every day. Hopefully we'll have a video or two more on Chaos Knights to come. I'm looking forward to looking through some new army lists. Finally, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page. It is what allows me to keep these videos coming quite so regularly. If you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.